The day my parents asked me for money was 5 days after I buried my husband and my little girl. That sentence still feels impossible to say out loud. At 36 years old, I stood beside 2 fresh graves, staring at the wet earth that covered everything I loved, while the people who were supposed to be my family were posting vacation pictures from Hawaii. My name is Savannah Reed, and that was the moment I finally understood the difference between relatives and family. Before everything fell apart, my life was simple. My husband Jake and I ran a small trucking business. We worked hard, saved every dollar we could, and raised our 6-year-old daughter Emma in a small town where everybody knew everybody. Jake was the kind of man who slowed down when everyone else rushed. Emma was the kind of little girl who drew 18-wheelers instead of princess castles. They were my entire world. Then one spring storm changed everything. I was several states, away on a delivery when Jake picked Emma up early from my mother's house because heavy rain had started flooding roads. He took a county route he had driven hundreds of times before. A low water crossing ahead looked harmless, but the creek rose faster than anyone expected. They never made it home. By the time I received the call, it was already over. I drove through the night with shaking hands, refusing to stop. Every mile felt like torture. My mind replayed impossible questions. What if I had stayed home? What if I had taken that route instead? What if I had called him one more time? None of it mattered. When I finally reached town, casseroles covered my porch and police vehicles sat in my driveway. Everyone already knew. Everyone except me. The first person I called was my mother. I thought she would come running. Instead, her first question was whether the funeral could be delayed. At first, I honestly thought I misunderstood. Then she explained. She, my father, my brother Ethan, and his wife Brooke were leaving for Hawaii the next morning. The vacation had been planned for months. Deposits had already been paid. The grandchildren were excited. I sat on my kitchen floor holding the phone, while she calmly explained why my husband and daughter's funeral would be inconvenient for their travel schedule. Then Brooke sent a message to the family group chat. She wrote that canceling an expensive vacation over what she called a minor family event would be unreasonable. A minor family event. My daughter's funeral. My mother responded with a thumbs up. That was it. No one asked how I was surviving. No one asked whether I had eaten. No one asked if I needed help planning a funeral for my child. They only wanted to know if another date would work better for them. Something inside me broke that day. Not loudly, quietly, like a rope finally snapping after years of strain. The funeral arrived on Saturday. The front pew was reserved for family. It stayed completely empty. Meanwhile, the church filled with people who actually cared. Jake's co-workers came. Emma's teacher came. Neighbors came. Friends drove hours to be there. The soccer team Jake coached showed up wearing their uniforms. More than 100 people packed that church. The only people missing were my parents and brother. I gave the eulogy myself because nobody else knew how to tell their story. I talked about Jake's kindness. I talked about Emma's laughter. I talked about how they were the greatest gifts life had ever given me. I never mentioned the empty seats. I didn't need to. Everyone could see them. 5 days later, my mother finally called. Not to apologize, not to comfort me, not even to ask how I was surviving. She called because she wanted $40,000. Apparently, Ethan's car dealership was failing. Loans were piling up. Sales had slowed. The family needed to come together and help. Then she said something I will never forget. We can always make more money. We cannot make more family. I nearly laughed. My family was buried in a cemetery. She was calling from an airport asking for money. When I asked why she thought I owed anyone $40,000, she explained her reasoning. Years earlier, my parents had given me $40,000 toward purchasing my first truck. According to them, it was time to pay it back. There was only one problem. It had never been a loan. It was a gift. I knew it. They knew it. The bank knew it. In fact, when I bought that truck, the bank required my parents to sign official paperwork confirming the money was a gift with no repayment expected. I remembered watching them sign those documents. Apparently, they had forgotten, or maybe they assumed I had. The next day, Ethan called. He didn't ask about Jake. He didn't mention Emma. He talked only about money. Then he said something even worse. "You're alone now. What do you even need it for? I sat there stunned, as if losing my husband and daughter somehow reduced my expenses, as if grief came with a refund. Soon other relatives started contacting me. Apparently my family had already begun spreading their version of events. Poor Ethan was struggling. Selfish Savannah refused to help. I had become the villain before I even answered their request. For a few days I considered giving them the money, not because they deserved it, because I was exhausted. I wanted the phone calls to stop. I wanted the pressure to end. One evening I actually opened my checkbook. That was when my Uncle Walter stopped by. He looked at the checkbook and quietly asked one question. Would you really pay people to keep abandoning you? The pen froze in my hand. He was right. I wasn't fixing a problem. I was rewarding one. The next morning I went back to work. Everyone expected me to fail. Brokers doubted me, clients worried, bankers suggested selling equipment. They looked at me and saw a grieving widow who would collapse without her husband. Instead, I worked harder. I called customers myself. I secured contracts. I rebuilt the business one load at a time. Then something unexpected happened. The company started growing. A major grocery chain offered a transportation contract bigger than anything we had ever handled. To accept it, I needed another truck. While cleaning out one of Jake's old rigs, I found something hidden inside. An old notebook. Most of it contained mileage records and work notes, but on the final page was a list of dreams. Things we are going to do. The title sat at the top. Below it were plans for expanding the company, buying more trucks, hiring drivers, growing the business. Then I saw one line that stopped my breathing: Reed and daughter transport. So Emma grows up knowing her mom built something. I stared at those words for a long time. Jake had already chosen the future. He had already imagined our daughter inheriting something meaningful. That night I cried harder than I had cried since the funeral. The next morning I filed paperwork changing the company name. Reed and daughter transport. Emma's name would live on every truck, every mile, every highway, every success. The business exploded after that. Contracts multiplied. New drivers joined. Within months, we had several trucks operating across multiple states. The company that everyone expected to fail was thriving. And suddenly, my family became interested again. My mother started sending supportive messages. My brother acted friendlier. The same people who ignored my darkest days wanted credit for my brightest ones. Then my cousin Rachel called with a warning. My parents were planning something. Their 40th wedding anniversary party was approaching. Dozens of relatives would attend. They intended to publicly pressure me into giving Ethan the money. If I refused, they would make me look selfish. If I agreed, they would win. They believed I had no escape. What they didn't know was that I had proof. I contacted my bank and requested certified copies of the original gift documents. A few days later, I held the papers in my hands. There were my parents' signatures, clear as day. The money was officially documented as a gift, no repayment required. No debt existed. The anniversary party arrived. The hall was crowded. My parents smiled confidently. They thought they controlled the story. After dinner, my father stood and tapped his glass. Then he launched into a speech about family loyalty. Eventually, he turned toward me. He reminded everyone how much help they had given me. He mentioned the $40,000. Then he accused me of refusing to help my struggling brother. The room went silent. Everyone waited for my response. I stood calmly. No anger, no yelling. No drama. First, I spoke about the funeral. I reminded everyone of the date. Then I displayed a photograph, a beach picture my mother had posted from Hawaii. The timestamp showed it was taken the day after Jake and Emma were buried. Several relatives immediately recognized it. Whispers spread across the room. Then I placed the certified bank document on the table. I explained exactly what it was. I pointed directly to my parents' signatures. I read the sentence aloud. The funds represent a gift. No repayment is expected. The silence became deafening. My father stared at the paper. My mother looked physically ill. Ethan jumped up and started shouting. I let him finish. When he finally ran out of words, I simply said that asking for help was acceptable. Demanding repayment for a gift was not. Then I looked at my mother. You told me family cannot be replaced. You were right. That is why I stopped trying to make one out of people who abandoned mine. No one spoke. The room had already reached its conclusion. The evidence spoke louder than I ever could. For the first time in months, people saw the truth. Not the story my family invented. The truth. I left before dessert was served. Outside, cold air filled my lungs. For the first time since losing Jake and Emma, I felt completely free. The dealership eventually failed. My parents kept trying to contact me for a while. Then the calls stopped. I never sent the money. I never regretted it. Today, Reed and Daughter Transport operates multiple trucks across the country. Emma's little drawing is painted on every vehicle. Drivers ask about it all the time, and every time they do, I get to say her name. I get to tell her story. That matters more than any revenge ever. The biggest lesson I learned is simple. Family is not determined by blood. Family is determined by presence. The people who stood beside me at the funeral became my family. The people who disappeared when I needed them most became strangers. Sometimes losing people is painful. Sometimes it is freedom. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stop carrying people who would never carry you.